Welcome everyone. Yesterday was pretty rough. We discussed quite a number of technical items. We looked at exploitation. We looked a lot at how could we try to prevent exploitation of our systems, even if you have vulnerable software. A bit of a continuation of day 2 that was, where we focused on payload delivery and execution, so how that could possibly be prevented. So what we're doing now in the next phase, so today is all about lateral movement. So we're going to discuss how adversaries attempt to try to move laterally throughout the network, or how you as a pen tester, red teamer, how you could try to move laterally throughout an environment. Big focus today is on AD. We have used AD already to push GPOs. We've done quite some work on that. Today we really start going into why is AD such a preferred target, and what are the potential attack strategies? Once you compromise one single machine, how do we proceed throughout the network? So how do we do lateral movement? So the whole principle of today, we start off today with the insider threat or the initial compromise, right? We assume that there is an initial compromise, which happened due to one of the strategies that we saw the days before. A payload that got clicked, a vulnerable system that was exploitable, but the adversary has one entry point into the environment and now starts moving laterally to find interesting systems, interesting data. They're looking for their objectives, they're looking for their target, after which they will continue to steal the data, make a manipulation, drop ransomware, who knows, I don't know. But the whole idea here is to move forward now in that attack chain. So topics for today, we have about 150 slides, which is I think the lightest day we have on slides, but there is 6 labs, however. So we will definitely be busy, we have our work cut out for us, but there's a lot of labs, so it's very, very hands-on. Aside from day 6, which is of course only hands-on, this is probably the most hands-on day that we have. So what do we do today? We start off with administrative access, because I already mentioned that we are looking at lateral movement here. So adversaries or pen testers moving from one system to the other. This typically requires admin rights, because they like to steal credentials that they find on one system to move to the next one. In order to prevent against such attacks, one thing is a key prerequisite and is a key control: restrict administrative access to your systems. It sounds very easy, it sounds very straightforward, but it is a core principle. If 90% of your employees has local admin rights, there's no way you can do decent security. It just doesn't work. It will not work in an AD environment, because local admin rights should be a very, very, very big exception. We'll discuss quite a bit on that. We'll also look into UAC, so user account control, which is a control offered by Microsoft as of Windows Vista, where the goal is to limit privileges available to a user even if they have local admin rights. Well, it's not necessarily, or it's not really privileges. The idea there is to prevent a user to accidentally use his admin rights while he wouldn't want to be using them. We get more on that. It's basically a control and implementation that focuses on the Windows access tokens to split up normal behavior and administrative behavior. Spoiler alert, it's not really a security control. Microsoft also, there's like a statement, I'll see if I can find it. They have like a paper or a blog post where they actually respond to a lot of the UAC bypasses, where they actually say we don't offer, for example, a bug bounty either for a UAC bypass, because we do not consider UAC a security boundary, which is a bit of an ambiguous term, whatever, but it means that they're not going to fix them. Or they might fix some of them, but they don't offer bug bounties for people who say, look, I found the UAC bypass. And you'll see we're going to look at a tool which is called UAC Me. Now you see me, now you don't, right? UAC Me. And the idea is that it does UAC bypasses. That's implemented about 45 different strategies. No, even more, I think they're at 60 almost now. But they work really well in all versions of Windows. So we're going to look at that. Then we're going to have a look at LAPS, so LAPS, a local administrator password solution. It's just one tool, but it's very useful to use in a corporate environment. The whole goal there is to change the local admin password that's used on different systems. It's one of those common things. It's one of those pen testing dream environments where you get local admin access on one machine, you dump the passwords, which are, well, the local passwords, and then you notice, hey, wait a minute, this local admin password is company name in lead speak, and then the year, something like that, or underscore local admin. It's like, yes, they're reusing this password everywhere. That's a mess. Solutions include commercial stuff like CyberArk, all that stuff. There's a whole bunch of these privileged access managers. Or you can use a tool like LAPS, Local Administrator Password Solution, which is offered by Microsoft. We're going to look at it, we're going to implement it, deploy it. So we're actually going to implement the control and see how it works. It's actually fairly nice. I do like it quite a bit. It's one of my top recommendations for companies who want to make improvements quickly, who want to progress. and we want to start moving towards better security. Then we're going to look at privilege escalation, because imagine that you have restricted local admin rights. You have done what you needed to do, and your end users do not have local admin rights. No one has it, because you have, I don't know, you fought the war, you won the war, right? Finally. Now, jokes aside, if people already have local admin rights, I mentioned it on day one, I think, trying to take them away is really, really painful. It's very hard. Not technically, because that's not hard. It's click, done. But it's just lots of discussions. You might have to change the way that people do their work, because they're used to having local admin rights, all of that stuff. But so imagine you do all of that, what could still go wrong? There are, of course, privilege escalation issues. In Windows, potential issues which allow a normal user to become a local admin. Question to you, can you think of any? Can you tell me, Eric, this is a local admin privilege escalation issue that I often use. If you're a pen tester, or if you're a blue teamer, if you say that's one that I have seen a lot. A way to get or to move from normal user to local admin on the system. Unquoted service paths, yeah, typical one. So misconfigured Windows services. Yes, the group policy thing, GPP, nightmare. Locally leftover credentials, which are still somewhere there on the local disk. Yeah, services that you can write to. Imagine that there's a service which runs as local administrator, but you have admin access to it. You have access to the binary path of the service, so you can write or you can change the executable path of the service. So the service tries to run, but it's no longer running the desired executable, it's running yours. Same thing for DLL search order hijacking, very similar, right? The big thing here is there are a lot of potential privilege escalation issues in Microsoft, which are not only fixable by patches, because some of them are issues in the core of Windows, right? Oh, look, there's a privilege escalation issue in Windows. Well, it's simple, install the patch. You might have misconfigurations though, and those are a bit trickier to spot. We're going to look at some tools for that as well. So yeah, there are quite some solutions to try to manage this local admin access, but you do need to manage it. Then attack strategies against the AD. Abusing local admin privileges to steal more credentials. So once you get local admin access, that's where the fun starts, right? Because I always compare it to a set of dominoes. That's how usually what a Windows AD environment looks like. Usually, it depends on how well it's hardened. And that means that you're looking for that first domino, which is usually a local admin somewhere. So you need to make sure, if you're defending, that you can keep the adversary away from that first domino, because once the first domino falls, things get messy. Once I get my first local admin in your environment, I'm not guaranteed to get domain admin, of course not. But I have a lot of options. I have a lot of opportunities to try to figure out a way to escalate privileges further, get into your domain, and move forward. We're going to look at hardening Windows against credential compromise. This is a pretty big lab. This is where we discuss, for example, how Mimikatz works to dump local credentials. We look at Credential Guard. We will deploy Credential Guard. We look at cached credentials. We look at all of that stuff. So once you have local admin access to a machine, there's a lot of things that you can abuse and that you can do to then use that to move further laterally. Looking at Bloodhound, a very familiar tool, very popular tool as well. Used by most pen testers. Very noisy though, it makes quite some noise because, well, it's noisy by design. It enumerates attack paths into the AD environment. So what does it do? It looks for users and it lists what users have access to what. So it gives you a nice overview of who are the most interesting users, and then it maps out where they are connected to. We're gonna see it in the lab. Well, to be fair, we have a pretty small environment, right? It's not a huge 2,000, 3,000 host enterprise environment or 20,000, 100,000 host enterprise environment. So our attack path is gonna look rather simple, but still, it's the principle. So what does it do? It can even work as a navigator, as a GPS almost, saying, oh, you wanna get to domain admin? This is how you need to go, right? So that's very nice, a very good tool, but does make some noise. It also relies a lot on enumeration from different local machines, because it talks to other machines to know what users are connected. So there's quite some things that you can do here. Private VLANs, for example, client isolation, those things are going to mess up Bloodhound quite badly. So those are things that you can look into. Kerberos, right? So then we have a huge section on Kerberos, discussing what is Kerberos in depth, how does it work. We're going to discuss all the different key types in Kerberos. You've got RC4, AES, for example, how do they work? But we also discuss, for example, the Kerberos long-term key, target keys. What are they, what role do they play, and what could possibly go wrong? Not a lot of people are actually very familiar with how Kerberos works in depth. We're going to try to go in at a pretty good level, pretty deep level, to understand, okay, but what's going on here, and why does stuff like Kerberosing even work? Then we're going to look at, okay, silver tickets, what are those? Golden tickets is for tomorrow, because a golden ticket, on purpose, we don't discuss it yet, because that's part of domain domination. If you get domain admin, okay, then you can start discussing golden tickets, skeleton keys, because then you are at another position. So tomorrow is golden tickets, skeleton keys, DC sync, DC shadow, that kind of stuff, because that all requires domain admin rights already. I call it domain domination, because at that point, Well, when you're a pen tester, that's when you chill out, right? It's like, okay, let me kick off my shoes, sit back and relax, because things are looking upward for me, so it's the fun part. Okay, overpass the hash. So anyone know what overpass the hash is? It's actually rather straightforward, but the idea is, pass the hash, we all know what it is. We're going to discuss it as well, but you know how it works. Pass the hash is a pretty simple ID. Take, for example, network authentication. Network authentication in a given environment. How does it work? NTLM v2, because that is pass the hash, NTLM v2. How does it work? What do you do? Well, you get a challenge and you generate a response. We discussed it 2 days ago. So you create that response based upon a secret. What secret? Your NT hash, right? Do you need a password to create that response? No, you need the hash, right? Because that's how Microsoft works. If you look at NTLM v2, the secret that's used is the NT hash. It's not the password as such, meaning even if you don't know the password, you could just use the NT hash. Fine. That's why pass the hash works in NTLM v2. That's what Metasploit does, right? If you do Metasploit, the PSExec, for example, with the hash in it, all of that stuff, very noisy though, because it's NTLM v2. So what Benjamin Delpy did, the guy who wrote Mimikatz, he said, well, a lot of people are saying, look at NTLM, right, to see pass the hash. He said, well, no, you don't have to. Because if you look at Kerberos, but more on that later, the initial Kerberos authentication works by encrypting a timestamp. What is the timestamp encrypted with? The NT hash of the user. So what he said was, well, I'll just do Kerberos authentication with pass the hash. So he calls that overpass the hash. It's the same thing, but now he does it in Kerberos, which means if you're looking at NTLM for pass the hash, it's done. You don't see it because it's all Kerberos now. So it's a nice way of blending further into the noise. Because you're now using pass the hash, but in Kerberos, not in NTLM v2. All of that we'll discuss. The thing about Kerberos though is that there's been a lot of ambiguity about it, like Kerberosting. It's a very simple attack strategy. Well, all my credits to Tim Medin, other SANS instructor, so of course a lot of credits to him, because he invented and coined that technique. But if you look at it, it's a simple principle. And again, very nice to find it, but he found it in 2014. And I was like, how on earth did it take us as a community to 2014 to find it? And apparently a lot of that is down to the fact that a lot of people stayed a bit away from Kerberos because it looked pretty nice with all of the tickets. But you notice that once people like Benjamin Delpy, Tim Medin, all of those guys start looking at Kerberos, it's like, wait, poke it a bit. This is not that good, right? So I'm curious to see how that's going to evolve because there's a whole ton of things that are moving there. Like Kerberosting, silver tickets, overpass dash, all of that stuff is all Kerberos-based attack strategies. How can we detect lateral movement then? So that's the detection part. We're going to look at logs, key logs that we need to detect it. Now, to be fair, we'll also look at detection in the different other exercises as well. But there we have a final lab, which is very focused on deception as well. So we're going to create fake honey hashes. So we're going to, well, honey tokens, I think is, I don't know what the official term is. I always call them honey hashes. But we're going to create fake hashes in memory and then use them to detect adversaries moving laterally in the environment, which are then trying to reuse our fake accounts. That's the idea. This will also include an MZ bypass again, but this time another one. So let's start off with the basics, right? Lateral movement. According to a certain study by Smokescreen, which is a vendor, they said that 80% of the time of an adversary is spent in lateral movement. Not sure if that's the exact number, but I think it makes sense. Give or take, it's going to be something like that. Because once you land on a system, you have access, right? You have limited access, maybe local admin access, all depends. But then you have to start figuring out what the environment looks like, because the adversary probably doesn't know yet. If they're coming back after previous compromise, they might have a clue, right? They might already know a bit about it. But usually when it's the initial intrusion, they need to figure out what the architecture looks like. So how did they put this in place? What are the different network zones? What users are here? Who's domain admin? How did they structure everything? What controls do you have in place? Because they don't know whether you've got AppLocker. They might. Always have to add a disclaimer, right? If they're coming back, if they're an internal insider, that's a different ballgame. But quite often, they need to enumerate a lot of information. Call it internal reconnaissance, if you will. They have to figure out, what does this environment look like? This is an ideal phase for two things, or for two reasons. One of them is they don't know what controls you have, so they're going to make noise, because they might bump into a control, which they might be able to bypass. But they didn't know it was there, so they might bump into it. But you could also spot the fact that they're enumerating those controls, because they're doing very typical things like getting the AppLocker policy, trying to figure out what kind of controls you've got implemented. Remember, yesterday we had a PowerShell line which was used to get, for example, the exploit guard configuration settings, those kind of things. But that allows you, if you have command line logging, to spot people enumerating that kind of info. Even stupid stuff. Net user/domain, enumerating domain users. HR does not do that. IT doesn't even do that usually because they're all in their GUIs, right? So command line stuff like that, those are things that you can look into because that by itself is weird, someone who's doing all of those things. So we're going to look into that. It does require endpoint visibility, and that's usually the reason why a lot of that fails, is because a lot of organizations don't have sufficient endpoint visibility to see all of that happening. So typical example, very simple. Adversary obtained access to a workstation through phishing. Hello, you clicked. Escalate privileges, or don't escalate privileges if he already has admin rights. Pillage credentials from that local system. Reuse credentials against other internal assets. Repeat 2 and 3 as you go along. Cycle until you get somewhere. Finally, access the crown jewels. Very simple thing, right? But this is what I all mentioned, right? This is what I talked about. So, a word on AD. We start slowly. We start discussing what AD looks like. AD is a technology developed by Microsoft. Amazing. Active Directory. So what is it? What does it do? Well, it provides authentication, authorization, identification services in an environment, amongst other things. It's usually the big crown jewel because it is where a lot of that stuff is stored. It's not limited to Windows systems though. Quite often you see that Linux systems are also joined to the domain environment. So there's a number of things that can be done. Do note that domain controllers and the AD are usually one of the key targets for adversaries. Does that mean they need to get domain admin to compromise your environment? No. And more we see that happening because you have data stored there and there and there and there and there. Sometimes getting domain admin for an adversary also means that they're taking a risk because there might be a lot of controls and a lot of detection features on the path to domain admin. So maybe the path to domain admin, even if you can get it, is not a good one. That being said though, it's still very popular. Why do you want to get domain admin? Because it's kind of like a catch-all. If I'm pen testing, I like to get domain admin. Why? Because I have everything, or almost everything. So it's like, I'll just get domain admin, and then afterwards I'll filter out what I need. That's a bit the principle there. Being greedy, right, as an attacker or an adversary. So that's a very typical thing. Already mentioned that identification. Of course, your domain controllers. I'm going quickly here, but just to make sure everyone knows. But your DCs are, of course, crucial. They offer DNS, they offer authentication, authorization. They're quite often the central pieces of the network environment. A compromised domain controller means a compromised domain. So that's important to note. If someone gets local admin to your domain controller, you have a very big issue. How does authentication in AD work? The biggest protocol is Kerberos, right? That's the one that's mostly used. It is not built or it's not created by Microsoft. Microsoft did not invent Kerberos. It's a protocol that has existed before that. They did probably the most well-known implementation of Kerberos though, Microsoft, and that's the one that they use in AD. It's a ticket-based system. The whole idea is allow two parties, a client and a server, to authenticate to each other over an insecure network channel that they don't trust. So the idea is they can authenticate to each other and they can trust each other. They don't want to send any sensitive information over that network because they don't trust it. So they don't want to be sending passwords or challenges, that kind of stuff. So they only trust one other party, the third party, which is the Kerberos server. Main components of such a transaction include the KDC, the Kerberos distribution center, which also has the AS, the authentication server typically, the client requesting access, and of course a service that is being requested access to. When Kerberos authentication is not available, Windows reverts to NTLM v2. And then everything goes on fire, as we discussed on day 2. But NTLM v2 and Kerberos, that's what you will be seeing in corporate environments. Usually most of it is Kerberos. Now there's a lot of different variants and encryption types that are being used in Kerberos as well. RC4, for example, which we'll discuss in depth, is a bit of a dumpster fire. But it's still most commonly used, or very commonly used in environments. Why? Legacy reasons. Right? So Kerberos uses encryption. Wow, really? Eric, really? Yes, it uses encryption. It uses a lot of encryption. But you can configure what kind of encryption it uses at what parts of its operation. And that's where you can do a lot of hardening and where you can also detect a lot of malicious stuff taking place. Kerberosing, for example, is limited to RC4. If they are using AES encryption in Kerberos, Kerberosing is no longer viable. But more on that when we get there. But that gives you some interesting insights, which means that Kerberosing is actually not that hard to spot. It's very simple to see in your environment. It's very noisy. But I've never been caught because most people are not looking at Kerberos tickets like, oh, that's too noisy, right? Because if you're looking at service tickets being created on your domain controllers, prepare to drown, right? To be fair though, if you've got ATA, for example, which is a product, Microsoft ATA, Advanced Threat Analytics, product they bought though, so they didn't create themselves. It's a tool focused very much on detecting AD attacks. They bought it, but it looks, for example, at RC4 encryption. But the nasty thing is, Kerberoasting is one of the attacks that only works for RC4, but there's a lot of other attacks which also work with AES. And now a lot of the detection controls in ATA, they focus on RC4. So the moment that you change your attack strategy and use AES, you become invisible. So there you go. This is very simple Kerberos without the details on the encryption types. So first of all, you send an authentication to request a TGT. So your first part is basically requesting a TGT, which is in more detail, you are proving that you are Eric, for example. Does anyone know what you're sending to prove that you are Eric in a Kerberos transaction? How would the key distribution center know that I am Eric? I don't send it a hash because that would be weird, because I don't trust the network channel. I take a timestamp and I encrypt it with my NT hash. That encrypted thing, I send it across the network. It goes to the key distribution center. What does the Kerberos key distribution center do? Takes that input and says, oh, you're claiming to be Eric. Let me take Eric's hash, because again, that's the domain controller, he has the hash. Decrypt the timestamp. Okay, yeah, indeed, it's readable, that's timestamp. You're Eric, fine. So what does it do? It sends me back a TGT, a ticket granting ticket. The TGT is what authenticates me. It tells me, or it tells the environment, but a TGT means I'm Eric. It has information on I am Eric, and it is, interestingly enough, created, of course, by the KDC. So the KDC created and says, here you go, here's your TGT. Keep this for future reference. The session key is not that important now, so I'll just not mention it just yet because it's a bit more technical. We'll go there, right? But I won't mention it yet. But imagine I have a TGT, fine. So next up, I want to access a file server. I want to go and access a certain system, application, something that's on the AD environment. Let's say a file server. I don't send the TGT to the file server because that doesn't work. Long story why that doesn't work, but the file server is not able to interpret all of the details of the TGT because the KDC has protected them. So what happens? Step 3, I send the TGT to the KDC and I say, hey, remember me, I'm Eric. Here's my TGT, right? You gave that to me, see, check. This says that I'm Eric. Give me a service ticket to go to the file service. The key distribution center, and this is a funny one, will always give me a service ticket. It's not going to check, is Eric allowed to go to the file server? It doesn't care. It says, okay, here's a service ticket. What does a service ticket include? It includes information about who I am and what groups I'm supposed to access. So it's kind of like your passport, if you will. It says, this is Eric, he has access to X, Y, Z, and all that stuff. That's sent back to me. So I receive that service ticket. The thing though, Kerberos is smart enough, and that's where all the encryption comes into play, that I cannot change that passport, supposedly. So I get that little passport document, and now with that thing, that service ticket, I can go to the file server. And the file server will open it and say, okay, according to what I read here, you are a local administrator on this file service, so I'm going to allow you access. A TGT, a service ticket, all of those tickets that get generated, they are all created by the KDC. So it's the one who creates all of that. Of course, there's a whole bunch of signing and encryption going on to make sure that that's coming from the right source. Now, there's a few interesting notes here, which I'll already like to share. First of all, bold statement, but Kerberos is stateless. What does that mean? This is one domain controller, one key distribution center. Imagine an enterprise environment with 200 domain controllers, which is very much not uncommon, right? It's very normal. It's even a small number. You can have more than 200 domain controllers. I get the TGT from one of them, right? Because I authenticate to the local domain controller here, and maybe a bit later I'm talking to another domain controller. Do I have to re-authenticate? No, because I'm sending the TGT to the other domain controller. The other domain controller never created the TGT. 10 hours by default. Can be changed, depends, 10 hours by default. We get to that, but this is stateless. And that's one of the reasons why a golden ticket attack works. Because the KDC, when I send back a TGT, step 3, it doesn't recall this. It's not like, oh yeah, that's Eric, I sent him a TGT previously. No, it doesn't care. It just says, okay, you send me a TGT, let me check. Is that a TGT that was created by a valid KDC? Stateless. Because some people say, because what's a golden ticket? A golden ticket is nothing more, without technical details, than a forged TGT. So I create my own TGT and I make it look like it's a valid one. And some people say, well, why does that work? Because the KDC never created the TGT. Yeah, but it doesn't care. It just checks, it's a valid TGT, it's fine. Because we have 200 domain controllers, one of the other 199 domain controllers probably created it. So fine. Stateless protocol. Fundamental principle, so Kerberos is stateless in that regard. It doesn't keep track of all the TGTs that have been assigned. The other interesting one, which not a lot of people realize, is I can get a service ticket for every single service on the domain. Because Kerberos here does not check whether I have access to that thing. It doesn't care. It just says, I'll give you something that you can present, and this guy is going to make the final call whether or not you're allowed to access it. We're going to get back to that, but know that this is how Kerberos works. So you can already see a couple of things. Something could go wrong. So how does authentication in AD work? NTLM v2 challenge response. There we go. We already discussed that at length on day 2. I request authentication, challenge response thing goes on. And of course, a response is created based upon the challenge. The response includes, and I use, of course, my NT hash to generate the response. Hence, pass the hash. Hence, SMB relaying, all of that stuff. Pretty nasty stuff here, NTLM v2. That makes sense, right? We already discussed this. So take a modern environment, 2019. NTLM v2 and Kerberos are both enabled typically in big, large AD environments. So how are credentials stored? So how does AD store these credentials? Well, first of all, hashes are stored in an encrypted format in the ntds.dit file. Furthermore, the ntds.dit file is protected, locked by the operating system. So you cannot just go onto the ntds.dit file and copy it. You need to mess around with it a bit. For example, create a volume shadow copy to create a read-only copy of the ntds.dit file. More on that tomorrow. How do you get access to the ntds.dit file? Compromise the domain controller. Oh, Eric, really? Oh, it's easy, right? Oh, yeah, just have to compromise the domain controller. Fine. Well, I've had better stories. Oh, what's that open network share? Oh, it's just our backup share. It's fine. It's not writable, but you can read all of it, so I can read all of the backups. Does that include the backup of the domain controller? Yes. Okay, you're done. Your environment's compromised. Because, well, I can go to your backup, get your ntds.dit file, and do my bidding. But more on that later. So how are the hashes stored? First of all, credentials, so passwords, are hashed using NTLM. NTLM or NT hash, which is, in fact, nothing more than what? What is an NT hash? What kind of hashing algorithm is it? It's a fancy name, but it's actually a very simple hashing algorithm. It starts with M. It's not MD5. It's MD4. So it's an MD4 hash of the password. It's not salted. Because why would you salt stuff, right? It doesn't make sense. So it's an MD4 hash of the password. That is the NT hash. This is the hash that you can use in pass the hash. If you steal one of these bad boys, game over. So that's important. Some people have asked me, Eric, how about landman hashes? If you're not living in the 90s anymore, landman hashes should not be present anymore. Landman used to be like, oh, they're still around. It's gone. Unless you still have Windows XP, you might see a few landman hashes still, but domain controllers no longer store landman hashes since Windows Server 2003. And the best part is, some people say, Eric, but how about backwards compatibility to Windows XP? But here's the funny thing. Since Windows 2000, Microsoft has used NT hashes to authenticate. So already since Windows 2000, landman hashes were there for legacy reasons. So unless you still have a Windows 98 machine somewhere in the environment, you don't need landman, right? That's an important point. So even in Windows XP in 2003, you still had landman and NT hashes. Why? For legacy reasons. But as of Windows Vista, they're completely gone. So it's only NT hashes which are being used. Those hashes are encrypted. So take that NT hash, encrypt it at storage, and they're encrypted using a symmetric key which is stored in the system registry hive on the domain controller. So again, compromise the domain controller, you can also get that key because it's a symmetric key, so you can decrypt everything. So it's hashed and encrypted in the ntds.dit database. So again, this further supports the idea of compromise the domain controller, compromise everything. So AD users and groups, schema admins, enterprise admins, domain admins, backup admins, a whole bunch of different AD users and groups exist already by default. You can add your own, you can make this fine-grained. Let's say you have 1,000 users, right? Because you have 1,000 employees. You're a pretty small company, not a very small one, but also not a huge enterprise. You have 1,000 users. If you have 100 domain administrators, you're doing something wrong. Now, why do I say this? Because I have seen that in environments. Oh, but all of our IT people have domain admin rights. It's the same as giving everyone local admin rights. It's a nightmare, and you will never be able to have any decent security level if that's the case. Domain admin accounts should never be used for normal operations. Microsoft even has a nice documentation on how to use that. They have an entire model for this as well, which is called the tiered admin model. I'll get back to it, we're going to discuss it, but the tiered admin model means a domain admin account should never, ever, ever be used on anything else than a domain controller or a privileged access workstation. More on that in a second. If your domain admins are just opening their corporate workstation and authenticating with the domain admin account, that's not what's supposed to happen, right? Every user in a Windows environment, both local and domain users, they have an SID. It's a security identifier. Every object even has this in an AD environment. Now, what does that look like? For every single normal user, it starts with S15. It's actually every single user and group starts with S15 because the auth level is 5 for users and groups. So that's usually S15. Then you have a very big string there, or an ID, which is the same for a computer, for all local users. They all have the same one because that string represents the local computer. Or when it's a domain, that string represents the domain. So for domain users, they will all have the same string there when they're part of the same domain. The RID is the relative ID. The most common ones are 500 for the local administrator, the default local admin, 501 for the default guest. As of 1000 then, it counts up. 1000, 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, as you create more admin accounts, more accounts. Every new account that you create gets a sequential number here. 1002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. This is informational. Access tokens. An access token is an object that describes the security context of a process or thread. This is used by Windows to understand what is the context here. Whenever you successfully authenticate, an access token is produced by the system. You authenticate, it creates an access token. Every process that you now execute with that user will have a copy of that access token, because that token means it kind of groups all of the processes together, saying, okay, those are all Eric's processes. They all have the access token of Eric, right? The system uses an access token to identify the user. When a thread interacts with a securable object. What's a securable object? A file share, a file on disk. So what happens, the OS checks, okay, this process is trying to access this specific file. Is it allowed to access it? Well, check the access token, right? So that's kind of your privilege, if you will. There's an interesting concept here. Impersonation. By default, the system uses a primary token when it tries to interact with a securable object, the primary token. But it can also use impersonation, where it says, I'm not going to use my primary token here, but I have another one that I'm going to use. I'm going to pretend that I'm someone else for a second. Why would you do that? It's very common in Windows. It happens all the time. Why is this a thing? Access for a modification, but practically, why would you see that happening? Or what's a very concrete example of when impersonation could be required? You run as administrator, for example. Use the admin access token, because it's not on this slide, but if you authenticate as an administrator, you get 2 tokens. One which is Eric, Eric the poor guy without admin rights, and the other one is Eric with admin rights. So it creates 2 access tokens, right? So it uses Eric without all the time, but it can also use Eric with admin. That's impersonation. We're going to see it. We're actually going to use this as well in labs. There's another example. It's a bit more trickier, but another example would be imagine FTP service. This is very, very dodgy, but it's another way of explaining it, which might help understand. Imagine a user can authenticate to an FTP service. The FTP server then impersonates the user security token to access the file system. Because the FTP service, which is running using potentially a service account, probably has access to all of the different user files, right? All of the different users which have an FTP account there. So it impersonates the user when it tries to access something. It's just one example. Does that make sense? Impersonation, the concept of how that works? Because this leads to a number of interesting things. You can already guess, but access tokens can also be stolen just like you can steal hashes. In that case, though, you don't get the credentials of someone. You just get an access token, so you can impersonate someone else because you just stole their token. We're going to see it in the lab, but we're actually going to play with this. Two-factor authentication for admin accounts. This is an interesting one, but it's something to note and to look into. I think this is a big one. A lot of environments, they have no 2FA whatsoever. I do think that's something to consider. Secure password selection. So these are just some ideas, some basic security controls that we need before we go into a first lab. Secure password selection. You can say, Eric, really? Do you have to come to 599 to hear this? Well, yes, but it is important though, because it's a mess. Typical issues that you see: static, never expire, easy passwords for service accounts, which opens the door for Kerber hosting. Reuse of passwords for local admin accounts. So the same local admin account everywhere, because it's the recovery account and no one's ever going to guess it. which might be true because no one wants to guess it, because they'll just get local admin access, dump the hash, and then reuse it all over the place. So that's an important one. Weak password complexity configured on ID level. And this one, the beauty of it all. The IT administrators bypassing their own password complexity settings. I've seen that a few times. But we don't need to follow this. I've seen some organizations who do this, the final one here. I'm not sure how realistic it is depending on what you're allowed to do, but I know some organizations who do it. I'm not sure how they legally set it up, but they just dump their own credentials on a monthly basis, for example, and they try to crack them. So they just dump the entities.dit file, they crack all of the passwords, and every password that gets cracked, the user gets a mail saying your password was cracked, change it. It's not strong enough. Trust settings and directions. The concept of trust, of course, between different domains. This sounds very easy and simple. One directional trust, bidirectional trust. But if you have a huge environment with multiple domains, multiple forests, this can become a huge, big issue. I know several companies who struggle with this to get good visibility on how has this been set up. If you're talking business for natural growth, or if your company just naturally becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, this is something that can be managed. But when you start going to acquisitions, that's a mess, right? Because you buy another company, which means, okay, let's take over the domain, right? So let's set up a trust, potentially a two-way trust, because you both trust each other. But of course, the one that you just bought is not on the same security level as the entire group. So you start exposing the environment and it starts degrading overall security. What's the idea here? Pingcastle. We use it very quickly on day one. It's part of the hardening thing. But one of the main things it does, it gives very easy insights in trusts. So it gives a very simple view of what different trust levels are configured. It even has this view where it colors different domains, and it shows you in an interactive map which ones are more secure than others in the forest. Let me maybe show you. So it can generate these kind of insights where you can see your different domains and how they're connected. You can even see the trusts which are set up. It has an entire legend about how they then work, but it also gives you scores so you can spot the bad ones. So you can spot the bad students in the environment. So that's pretty nice. To spot, okay, these are big ones that we need to investigate. Again, their goal is to provide simplicity and to make sure that you can maintain the overview and you see, okay, what are the big issues here. So these are some basic concepts. We're gonna make this more concrete, but just FYI, if you wanna know more about basic Windows and how ADs are set up, because we're gonna look at red and blue parts of this. If you want to know more just about the basics, two references I want to add. Microsoft has done amazing work with best practices for securing Active Directory. That's one of their KB posts. It's big though. Never say, I don't know how to secure AD, because Microsoft has the guide. It's very exhaustive. It has all of the information in there. Very good guide though, but it's very big. And to be fair, it's easy when you're building a new AD. It's like, oh yeah, of course. But if you're struggling around, if you're pulling a legacy thing further and you're trying to make improvements as you go, you have to be a bit more selective. And we're gonna try to focus today on quick wins. Things like, okay, you can do this, you can do already that, you can start doing this. But there's a pretty good guide there from Microsoft. And since, of course, we have a course 505. Jason Vossen is pretty amazing. He's one of the guys who currently has the Server 2019 ISO, because Microsoft released it, I think, a few months ago, but then they took it down again. But before they took it down again, he had already downloaded it, so he's already playing around with it. So it's one of those guys, but he's very smart. adsecurity.org, yeah, very good reference guide. Sean Metcalf, I reference him in the next few labs, almost all of them, because when I was doing this day, I was on his blog all the time. The guy is pretty amazing as well. adsecurity.org is the guide there. Principle of least privilege and UAC. Well, here we go. Imagine you pick up the fight, right? Because Eric told you local admin rights should be gone. So how do we start doing that? Here's a couple of reasons. If you have to convince the business that local admin rights are a bad idea, well, of course, malware data leakage, we already discussed, right? Security, bad idea because it's going to compromise your environment, but also helpdesk cost. People who have local admin rights are more likely to mess up their own computers, because they will install junk. They will do things, they will change things. They find a guide online which tells them to do something weird, and they break the computer. It's literally protecting them against themselves. So even your helpdesk cost might go down if you do that properly. Network slowdown. I don't want to tell you how many incident response cases we've had where we've had to work on crypto miners on the local system, people torrenting, people streaming. So for security, because this is of course our goal, Local admin rights assigned to end users should be highly exceptional. And again, I know that there might be exceptions. I know how it goes, right? It's a business. There might be a certain reason for someone to have certain rights. In our organization, no one has it. Only the guys who manage IT. Once you start seeing how easy it is, once you get local admin rights, to start moving laterally in an environment, that's where you see, okay, we really need to make sure that people don't have these rights, because you cannot trust people with that kind of access. That doesn't work. Admin users should have separate accounts for normal and admin work, and that's a big one. That's one of the things we actually had to improve. We did it about 2 years ago. Before that, our IT had already said, okay, no one gets local admin rights, but the IT guys had a local admin account because, well, they're IT. But there was a discussion on should we have a separate account? And since 2 years we have it, because I actually showed them, look, here's UAC, boom. And they're like, ah. So UAC doesn't help there. It's good for accidents, for people accidentally using those rights. But if you are a person with local admin rights and you click my phishing link, I have tons of ways of getting around UAC. So that's a big thing. So you want to make sure that they have separate accounts for different kinds of work. Limit accounts with broad and deep privileges. This is more on the domain level. We already discussed this, but restrict the number of users in admin groups, avoid domain administrator accounts, help desk users with domain admin accounts. I see this all the time. Oh, call the help desk. Something needs to be installed on your workstation, and they authenticate your machine with the domain admin account. What are you doing? Well, we need to manage all of the workstations. Okay, so you need workstation admin rights, right? Not domain admin rights. Well, yes, but then maybe we want to do no. Wait, go back. No, you don't need domain admin rights. So always that. There are not a lot of reasons for people to need domain admin rights. The people who need domain admin rights, they are the people who are managing the AD infrastructure and all the trusts and all of that stuff. That's domain admin level. Anything else is very far from that. Restrict systems that can be used with the admin accounts. Restrict use of the generic built-in admin account, root or administrator. People are using that account, that's also a madness, right? Because who used it? So users and groups, domain admin membership should be required only in break glass scenarios. This is an official statement, if you will, from that best practices guide that I referenced already. So Microsoft says there's no reason for people to be in a domain admin group. It should only be in break glass scenarios. Now, we have to be a bit pragmatic here, right? I know how it goes. What you want to avoid is a situation with 1,000 users, 100 domain admins, right? So that's something that you want to carefully stay away from. And next to that, you want to be a bit pragmatic. It's probably normal to have 1 or 2 domain admin accounts that are used for certain tasks, right? Managing, administering the domain. You just want to find the balance there. How they would like it is if you use, for example, a privileged account management solution. Take a CyberArk because it's just a very easy example because they're very well known. Take, for example, that. Have a whole bunch of temporary domain admin accounts which can be checked out with passwords, but don't have people with a domain admin account continuously all the time in the domain admin group. That's the idea here. That's the way to set it up. Just enough admin. It's pretty new. It looks very interesting though. I don't have customers who've deployed it just yet. It's a bit of management though, but this is very nice. Very, very impressive. This was made available by Microsoft. It relies on PowerShell to do a number of interesting things. Just enough administration is like sudo almost for Windows. Sudo from Linux on Windows. So how does it work? You can create role capability files, session configuration files, and what do? Very simply put, you can install this on a system, and if a system uses JA, just enough admin, you create certain roles. And it knows, for example, that Eric, let's say Eric is a developer. Imagine that I'm a developer, and for some reason you decide Eric needs to have access to the production logs of the web application server, because he needs to troubleshoot something. He does not need to change the source code, of course not. He also does not need to do any kind of admin tasks on that machine. There's a few options of achieving this now. Maybe someone can go get the logs and send them to me. Or maybe you want to allow Eric to go and get them. This is where just enough admin comes into play. You can specify very specifically, Eric is allowed to do these and these and these commandlets on that server. So it's kind of like fine-grained admin management. So you can say Eric is not a local admin on the production web server, of course not, because he's a developer, but he can do a few things which would normally require local admin rights. So we give him very specific rights. That's what JA does. It works with the jump host, a central one, and then you go from there to other different hosts. Under the hood, what it uses is a local admin account, right? So there's a local admin account which is being used to do all of those tasks then. That's how it sets up, how it's done. This is a screenshot of the helper tool. So it's available as of Windows 10 and 2016, but they backported it into Windows 8 and 2012 as well. So here you can see, for example, how you can design your role capabilities, and you can specify different roles. You could say these guys are able to do X, Y, Z. I think this is the future. Eh? Maybe not that specific tool, but the way of doing things, it's very specific on what roles are allowed for what specific users. So you can be very fine-grained. It's of course a bit of management, agreed. The tiered admin model, I referenced this already, but this is the reference design or how administrative credentials should be used. An AD environment, again, no domain admin should connect to the workstations. That's not how it works. But the idea is you have different tiers, and they have tier 2, tier 1, tier 0. Very simply put, tier 2 are workstations. It's everything that interacts with end users. It's, you can see printers, you can see, I think, phones in there, workstations. That's one layer or one tier of administrative access. The next one is services, cloud servers, cloud services, everything which is, well, more on the service level. And this is identity services, domain controllers. So simply put, workstations, servers, domain controllers, right? So you have different layers and you have different tiers. And the idea, of course, is normal that you don't have a domain admin account which operates here, logging in here or here. That doesn't make sense. It's a model, right? This is not a technology, but it's a model of how to build that up, how to set it up, and how to do it. You could say, Eric, imagine our domain admins, the guys who manage the domain. They cannot physically walk to the domain controller, right, and log into it. What kind of a workstation should they use? Privileged access workstations. So this is PAW. What the idea here is, you have a dedicated workstation for administrative users. So they say if you have admin users, administrative users, who need to manage the AD, like an Azure AD or the actual AD which is on site, they should not use the workstation that they use for other stuff. Opening their mails, opening Office documents, all of that stuff. But the idea is to harden this one, the privileged access workstation, the one which is actually used for all of the administrative tasks. It's completely locked down. It's got exploit guard on there, credential guard, all of the nice little Windows 10 features, all of the crazy stuff, which might break other things. But that's because that's where your domain admin accounts are going to be used. So if someone ever compromises your environment, they would also need to get to those machines or to those to actually get domain admin rights. Yeah, it's basically jump boxes, if you will. It's a principle, right? That's how they describe it and how it should be done. So you can see Microsoft, they've actually spent quite some effort on all of this, on thinking about how to do that. Anyone ever looked at the Microsoft reference architecture for cybersecurity? This is our reference architecture. That's how you do security. There's commercial stuff in here, but also free stuff. So how they all fit together. It's interesting just as a reference to know. Eric mentioned, for example, here, privileged access workstations. He mentioned Justin of Administrator. There's Defender ATP, which is their EDR tool, which then I think goes up probably to the SOC, and then you've got all of their stuff there. Windows 10 Enterprise Security, there's antivirus, exploit protection, all of that stuff as well. So they just put everything on there, which is interesting. I'm not selling this, I'm just telling you that it's interesting. They have that publicly available, their entire thing. You probably need quite a deep pocket to buy all of this stuff, of course. Local users and groups, I'll be brief. Local users should be an exception. They are not manageable. It doesn't work, it doesn't make sense. You don't want to have local users all over the place. I always advise get rid of local users. It doesn't make sense. It's just hard to manage. It's unnecessary risk. Okay, you need people with local admin rights. I get it, but that should be a domain account, not a local user, right? So that's something to look into. Most organizations do this though, so they work on that. But then they do the thing that I mentioned before. We'll create a local admin account, right? The one that we keep for recovery, for if the domain goes down. And then they have it as administrator, and then they change the password to something very complex, very long. Let's say a 200-character password, which sounds very good because no one's ever going to guess it. But then someone gets local admin on one of the machines, dumps the hashes, doesn't even bother to crack the password, reuses the hash, and compromise all of your workstations. Boom. Happens all the time. Bad idea. So you don't want to do that. That's where Labs comes into play. I've seen ones where they rename the local admin account, right? Well, security by obscurity, I'm a bit divided on, because okay, it's not bad as such, but just know that it's security by obscurity. It doesn't help that much. I've even seen worse. I've even seen a company and they had renamed the local administrator account to guest and the guest account to administrator. But the RID is still 500 and 501. They changed their local admin account to guest. Introducing Labs for local administrator accounts. So Labs, free solution by Microsoft. How does it work? It generates a secure random password, so a completely randomized password for the default local admin account with RID 500, and it stores it in the AD. So that account or that password is stored in the AD. a couple of remarks. These passwords are stored in certain objects in the AD scheme. So you need to create the AD scheme, you need to prepare it. We're going to do that in the lab. You need to run a few PowerShell scripts to prepare the AD environment for that. There's specific ACLs which define who has access to those objects. You can already guess, not everyone should have access to those objects. By default, if you configure labs right, you're not going to have any issues with that. If you mess up your AD environment and your schema and objects, you might just have that, right? So that's important to note. A lot of privilege escalation tools, they will look for that. And this brings me to one of the critiques on LAPS. Jason Vossen, the guy I mentioned already, who teaches 505, he has a blog post called Don't Use Labs. Now, to be fair, he's not saying never use it, he just proposes a better alternative, because he wrote a number of scripts on top of it, which also encrypt the password before it is stored in AD. I leave it up to your judgment to see if you want to use it. My position on the whole matter is, this is good, it's definitely not bad, but just use your brain. Make sure that the password doesn't get compromised, because the password is stored in clear text, of course, in a secured AD object. The idea here, the principle, the mindset of Microsoft is if they have access to that domain, well, you're done anyhow, right? So that local admin account no longer matters, which makes sense. But I also see the critique of, okay, well, if someone then messes up the AD environment or the AD objects, you might have an issue. Conclusion, use it, but make sure it's well used. I think that's the key thing. You can very easily check what kind of access rights are set on those ACLs, or on those objects, sorry. So you can very easily check, are those objects correctly configured, securely configured? So I would highly recommend doing that. We're going to use this in a lab. This is not a password save, though. Just a quick one. Because people might think, oh, so we can use it as a password save. No. You could, because there's like a helper tool which allows you to then check out the password and take it. But that's not the goal here, right? We're not using these local admin accounts for continued access. Of course not. These are recovery accounts. The idea is, if a machine drops from the domain, that the administrator can go to his workstation, can open his tool and can say, okay, check out the local admin password for that machine. Okay, it's completely random. I'll take it and I'll now go to the machine, authenticate to it, and I can recover it, join it back into the domain. Not as a password safe or vault or however you would like to call it. User account control. UAC. Oh, the beauty of UAC. So what UAC? Tokens, right? Remember, a token gets created. You log on to the Windows machine, a token gets created, an access token. That access token is then assigned to all of the other processes that you launch. So Explorer.exe runs with your access token. When a regular user authenticates, the bottom thing, very simple. You get an access token and it's used to launch Explorer.exe, or it's added to Explorer.exe. All of the processes run with that access token. Nice. If you're an administrator, however, UAC comes into play, as of Windows Vista. It creates a full admin access token and a default user access token. The full admin access token is used for admin rights, but it's not used by default. It's just available. The default user access token is used to launch Explorer.exe, for example. In simple terms, to explain this to your management, run as administrator. That's what's going on. But there's a lot of subtleties to this, or small things that you can adapt, that you can change. Before Windows 7, you had on or off. UAC is on or off. That was Vista. As of Windows 7, there's 4 levels. Never notify, which is kind of like off, up till high. So with different notification levels. The notifications can also be configured to actually ask you, do you want to allow this app to do admin? Yes or no. Or they can even be enforced to request a re-authentication, to give your passwords again, to check the credentials again. So you can go very far in this. You can make a lot of different changes. You can tweak this very subtly. Allow me to go a bit further on this. You have group policy settings to further fine-tune this. For example, admin approval mode for the built-in administrator accounts, which means RID 500. By default, all apps are run with full privileges. If you authenticate to a machine with RID 500, by default, it does not do UAC. It doesn't tell you, it just runs everything as an administrator when it needs to. Interesting. That's why if you connect to the domain controller using your RID 500 with the default domain administrator account, if you click the CMD, it opens as an CMD prompt as an administrator, because it's a RID 500 account. Allow UI access applications to prompt for elevation without using the secure desktop. What is the secure desktop? You have all seen the secure desktop before. When UAC prompt comes up and everything blurs, that's secure desktop. The idea is the blur means, okay, this is an isolated prompt, right? That's the secure desktop, basically. So a couple of others here. Prompt for consent for non-Windows binaries. You can see here behavior of the elevation prompt for standard users. Prompt for credentials. Normal, of course, because a normal user doesn't have admin rights, so we'll have to give credentials. But you can see here behavior of the elevation prompt for administrators in admin approval mode. You can go as far as saying, even if you have admin rights, instead of asking yes or no, which is the prompt for consent, prompt for credentials. So give me your credentials again, which is interesting. So that's another setting that you could use. Not default though. Detect application installations and prompt for elevations. I never knew this one. I didn't know what it was. I accidentally found it. Even before I knew that this was a setting in UAC. Allow me to demonstrate, because this is a really fun one to show. So I'm opening just our LODS environment, which you're going to use to do some labs as well in the near future. Allow me to authenticate. Awesome cells 1, 2, 3. So let's use, I don't know, let's use PAFish, right? That's this thing here. Let me just put it on the desktop for a second. Copy. Voila. What does PAFish do? It tries to determine whether it's running in a sandbox or not. Nothing malicious, nothing bad about that. I can run it, right? I double click it. Start running. Stop. I don't care. But it runs, right? Interesting. Now I could try running this as administrator, right? Run as administrator. This guy doesn't have admin rights. It's my Alan Marshall account. It's not my alanmarshall.adm account, for example. So no admin rights. Doesn't work. Eric, where are you going with this, right? Of course. Rename. Interesting. Double click. I renamed it to PAFish-install. So Microsoft automatically tries to determine whether or not that's an installation file that would require admin rights. So it automatically prompts for admin rights, which is funny, right? It's install, see if I take away the L, it's still doing it. But if you do, it's gone. So if you rename it to, for example, I think upgrade or update is another one. A patch is another one, I think. Oh, wait, my machine's a bit slow here. UPF, that's not one. There you go. So it has a few of those keywords. I think they're somewhere listed on the KB article. Whenever I show this, everyone's like, that's funny. No one has ever seen it. Why did I find it out? Because I was running a CTF once, and students were creating payloads, and they had to create a payload, and my script, I had a script which automatically clicked everything, right? That was my setup. And everyone's got their payload, so everyone's nice and happy, and like they're trying to do lateral movement, and one team sitting there, Eric, our payload isn't executing. So I'm like, okay, it's weird. So I troubleshoot and I look at all of the payloads which are on my machine, right? The victim machine, supposedly. And I'm like, but yours has like an icon, like a UAC icon. Say, wow, these guys are super smart. They compiled it with very specific settings or something. I have no clue what happened. He was like, Eric, amazing. So I told him, like, what did you do? Show. And they're like, yeah, we just followed the book. That's how we're supposed to generate a Meterpreter payload, right? I'm like, yes. And I started playing around with it and I moved it around, and then I don't know why, but I renamed it to something test or something because I want to see it, and it suddenly disappeared. I'm like, oh no. And they had created something which was called install.exe, and that was the reason why. So that's that setting. Detect application installations and prompt for elevation. Because Microsoft tries to detect this is an installation of something. So I need to do UAC. The thing was, my script didn't execute because the user didn't have admin rights. Think of it, if you are an adversary, if you're phishing someone, it's all or nothing. If they have admin rights, they'll give them to you immediately. If they don't have admin rights, they cannot run your file. So all or nothing. But to be fair, UAC can be bypassed, so not really relevant. UAC bypass techniques. That's the big one. In Windows 7, sysprep.exe is vulnerable to a DLL search order hijacking vulnerability, which is exploited by the Metasploit framework bypass UAC. So that's the module, it uses that. Empire has a lot of ways of getting around UAC. And then finally, there's this one, UAC Me, which has 30 plus UAC bypass techniques. You can assume, safely assume, that UAC is not a valid security control, which means that you need this. Separate accounts for administrators, that's the big one. Because of UAC and because of the mess UAC is, it's a good control, right? It's good for accidentally using your admin rights when you're a normal administrator. But when you're dealing with an adversary in your environment, it doesn't really work. So you do want to make sure that people are using a different password on their accounts. Quick note on that, and just to show you, because I think that is relevant as well, because you could say, okay, but Eric, how about Windows 10, right, with all of the nice features? Windows 10 has done a lot of different things, very strong, very nice, big fan. UAC has not been fixed. It's not that this is fixed now. Even in our environment, you'll see that our default UAC setting, it's medium, I think. You can put it on high, the highest level you can find. The UAC Me bypass still works. So you're going to do it in the lab to see how it works. So this is UAC Me, very well maintained. The guy is very proud of it, so he maintains it very, very well. So you can see 18 days ago, 8 days ago, the last updates, so it goes very nice. And here, this is the best one. How it works is very simple. You run the tool, it's called akagi64.exe. It's because he has a set of tools, and the entire thing is called UAC Me, but the one that you use to do bypass is Akagi. Whatever, detail. Because you're going to be running it later on, and you might be, Eric, why is this called Akagi? It's not UAC Me. That's why. But you just run it with a number. What does the number mean? So you run akagi64.exe 1. That means try UAC bypass technique 1. Which one is that? Here you go. Here's the entire documentation. But you can see here works from fixed in. So it doesn't work in our Windows 10 environment. This is the one of the original ones, which is used by Metasploit. You could say, Eric, it's fixed. Yes, okay, but wait. Yeah, well, I said 30 plus, but fixed in, unfixed, 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 fixed in, unfixed. There's quite a few of these. 47, we're at 50, I think 60 plus, we might just make it, 55. Right, there you go. Not all of them still work, but more than 10 or 20 still work, so yeah, it gives you an entire overview on how to use it. Very smart guy as well, definitely worth having a look. So let's do a lab. We're going to implement labs, just to show, it's one lab, just to show a control. As part of this exercise, I think you're actually going to reuse a local admin password as well, or local admin hash that you stole, just to show this is what happens when you have the same local admin hash. The goal here is to then deploy a control, which is deploying labs. Maybe another quick one, but the UAC bypass, we're going to do that in the next lab, just so you know. We mentioned it now already, but we're going to do it as part of the local privilege escalation techniques. So during the lab, you'll notice that we're actually using Mimikatz already. And you might think, Eric, we haven't discussed Mimikatz yet, how it works. We're just using it now as an example of stealing a local admin credential and then T-hash that we're going to reuse. It's just showing it quickly, but we're going to go a lot more deeper in the concept or in the principle. The idea is just to show this is what happens when you have the same local admin password on two machines. Could be stolen. You could use passdash in Mimikatz to go to another machine. We're then going to deploy labs to show this would stop that form of an attack. The technicalities and how Mimikatz works in depth we're going to discuss, of course, today. So this was the first lab out of 6 for today. The next section is rather short. I'm going to walk through some typical privilege escalation issues in Windows, and after that we are immediately going to do another lab. So we're going to check out typical misconfiguration issues, things that may have gotten missed, so things that you could abuse to get local admin rights. So here are some very common ones. We already mentioned DLL search order hijacking about 20 times now, but it's one of those things which can be used for persistence, but of course also for privilege escalation. Remember sysprep, the one that we mentioned just now, which was actually more of a, not really privilege escalation, but that very specific one was used to do an UAC bypass, which is also referenced on the UAC Me GitHub, which I showed a little while ago. Unquoted paths with spaces, a very, very common one. The idea there is that imagine that you have a Windows service which is configured incorrectly, so there is ambiguity to where the actual executable is at. And that might allow you to hijack that path. More on that in a second. Writable Windows service executables, very straightforward. If a service runs with administrative privileges, which often happens, let's say it runs with anti-authority privileges, and it points to a certain binary to launch. What if I, as a normal user, can change that binary? Well, guess what? Then I can become a local administrator, because I can change the binary, I can make the service restart. Could say, Eric, not true, because as a normal user, you cannot restart the service. Well, if it's an auto-start service, I'll just reboot the machine, right? There you go. Always install elevated registry keys, unattended install files, and group policy preferences. So we're going to zoom in on quite a few of these. So this often is linked to leftover credentials which are still there from system installations. For example, the unattended install file, that's a typical sysprep sysprep XML files which are left behind, which includes unattended.xmls, for example, which have a base64 encoded version or a variant of the password, which is a bit of a mess. So you want to make sure that that's cleaned up well. The first one we want to touch upon is unquoted pods with spaces. Here we can see two services on a Windows 10 machine. On the left-hand side, you can see VMware Tools. On the right-hand side, you can see OpenVPN. What could possibly go wrong with one of them? The right one has a space in it and doesn't have quotes around it. What does that mean? Well, there's ambiguity on how Microsoft could interpret that, or how Windows could interpret that. In this specific case, though, it's typically not exploitable, although it's a bit dirty here. Because this is standard install. This is not something I made intentionally vulnerable. The proper way of doing this would be having quotes around the paths for both of them, right? So it's a bit weird that OpenVPN in this case hasn't done that, which is interesting because that's just the default install. But wait, Eric, you said it could be vulnerable. Why? Well, because that's what could happen. This is OpenVPN. Let's assume that this OpenVPN service is sitting there. C program files OpenVPN bin openvpn server.exe. Now, Microsoft needs to launch that executable. So when the service starts, it goes to that binary to execute it. How does it do that? Well, two options, because based on that, there could be two things that you mean. You could either mean option one, which is indeed the first thing it tries. The file path is C program. Files OpenVPN bin openvpn server.exe is nothing more than an argument, right? Because it's a space, and that thing follows. Option two, and that's actually what you mean, or what the service means, is C program files OpenVPN bin openvpn server.exe, and there's no arguments. What's the danger here? If an adversary could write to C, they could put, for example, C program.exe, right? Put it there, and then of course restart the machine. What happens when OpenVPN service starts? It will execute C program. Very simple, very stupid little trick, often quite effective. This is just a small command line at the bottom here to try to find these kind of vulnerabilities in your environment. There are of course tools that look for that. These are things that you can do. Nessus even can scan for it if it's doing an authenticated scan. So those are things you can pick up. The big one here is, though, that it doesn't necessarily mean you have to patch. It's configuration review as well. You do have to keep an eye out on your machines to make sure that these kind of things don't exist. Unattended install files. So these are unattended files, very classic. It's old school stuff, but sometimes happens. You could have something like this. For example, an unattended.xml file left over on the local system in one of the following locations. Base64 is, of course, encoding, which means it can very easily be decoded. So you might have a local admin account with a password sitting there waiting to be pwned, right? So that's another one of those things you want to check. Group policy preferences, GPP, pentester's favorite, works really well, works really nice. What's going on here? So group policies need to be available or need to be accessible to different users in the environment, right? A group policy needs to be readable by the different objects in the AD environment because they need to apply the group policies, of course. Now imagine that you have an ID. You think, well, I'm going to change my local administrator password and I'm going to set a certain local administrator password across the entire fleet. I'm going to set a very secure or very complex password for every single account in the environment. Right, why not? This often happens. It's bad, I already discussed why not. Don't do this because it's a mess, but I've seen this quite often being done. There's two reasons not to do that. One of them is because your machine might get compromised, or one machine gets compromised, and now they have the password for everything, or they have the hash for everything. The other reason is this one. That information needs to be stored, because you configured a new password for the local administrator account, which is set using a group policy, but Microsoft needs to find a way to set that password on every single machine. How does it do that? Well, it stores that information, or it attempts to store that in a secure fashion. How? It stores it in a C password variable. The C password variable or attribute is encrypted with a node 32-byte AES key. AES is of course symmetric encryption, so the same key is used to encrypt and decrypt, and known. Pretty bad though, because your group policy files, your XML files, they all are world readable, and they should be, because that's how your group policies are being applied. But Microsoft released the key for the encryption of that password. So that means that if you have one of those files around, it's very simple for an adversary to just enumerate your sysvol folder. The sysvol folder is of course where all of your group policies are stored, and to look for C password values. Microsoft patched this They addressed the vulnerability in MS14025. But the one big danger there is that quite often those files are left behind. Because even if you deploy that patch, if you install it, you're going to have an issue. Because that password might still be there. It might still be sitting there. So it better no longer be used. I've had a few environments where I pen tested the environment, got one of those C password values, and that was a local administrator account on quite a few of their workstations still. And they were annoyed because they knew about the vulnerability, they thought it was fixed, but they fixed it, but they didn't clean it up. So the previous part was still there. So that's an important one. So what does that look like? You can do this yourself, right? Run find str, find string, grep, if you will. What are you looking for? String C password. Where are you looking? On your logon server, so in your domain controllers, /sysvol star.xml. If you find a value like that, bingo time, right? You want to have a look. Most pen testing tools like Metasploit, Empire, Meterpreter, all of that stuff, they include that key. They have it in them, so they can immediately dump the clear text password as well. That's the key, by the way. So it's published in a KB article by Microsoft. There you go. Pen tester favorites. That's like, oh, look. Now, to be fair, if you run that, you should see it, right? If someone runs that in your environment, you should know. If you have Defender ATP, for example, which is an EDR tool by Microsoft, again, they have alerts for this. So one I know because I tried in our own environment as well. Let me have a quick look. Boom. It's like IT, 1 hour later, Eric, what are you doing? Oh no, just looking around. It's like, okay. So you could say, okay, Eric, that's many different options or many different privilege escalation things because this was not even exhaustive. So how can we check our environment or how can we test our environment? But also how can we as pen testers use this? Because this is again red and blue. Two tools, both of them are used or are meant to be used by pen testers, but you can use them from the different aspects. If you're trying to figure out whether your environment is secure, you can use them. Also, if you're trying to do adversary emulation, if you're trying to do privilege escalation, you can also use them. Beeroot and PowerUp are the ones that we are referencing. Mark just shared Watson by Rastamouse, which is another one. So Rastamouse is the guy who is also known. He also worked around on the MZ bypass. So Beeroot, PowerUp. PowerUp is part of Empire. It's all PowerShell based. These are pen testing tools though, which means they might come back with a few false positives. Quite often happens, especially PowerUp. Why? Because it often struggles with the interpretation of inherited permissions and stuff. So you often have to weed a bit through the stuff to find actual issues that matter. But still, they are pretty effective tools and they work pretty well to get visibility. So we're going to use them. We're also going to use UACMe in this lab as well to see how that can be used. The nice thing about PowerUp, which I like a lot, it even gives you the command line to abuse it. So it tells you, okay, this one is vulnerable. You want to abuse it, this is the command line to run. So it's nice and easy as a pen tester as well. So we're going to do that. We're actually going to abuse it as well. So we're also going to abuse a privilege escalation issue that you might possibly find on your systems. Now, any vulnerability you find might be relevant when you're doing the defend the flag as well, because you are working on a very similar environment as the one that you have now. Just throwing that out there. If you see things that you think, I might want to harden that, might be worth taking a note of it. So let's get started because we have a lab coming up again. So we're going to do a privilege escalation using these tools, see how they work, see how we can use them. You can see reasonably easy. Anyone play with the UAC meeting as well? It's also pretty straightforward, so pretty good fun to be had.